afternoon to the rest of you. A very warm welcome to this webinar, which has been hosted by the William Temple Foundation. A very quick word about the William Temple Foundation. We are a public theology think tank established nearly 80 years ago in memory of Archbishop William Temple, who many of you know was the Archbishop of York and then Canterbury during World War II. And he worked very closely with his colleague William Beveridge to kind of found and create the universal and comprehensive welfare state that took shape after the Second World War. And he laid out the kind of moral and ethical principles for that welfare state in a short book he published in 1942 called Christianity and Social Order. And he's also the person who actually coined the phrase the welfare state back in 1928. So we as a foundation exist to try and promote public discourse about the nature of society in which we're living, the role of faith and belief in that debate, and trying to open up as many conversations as we can about the sort of social order that we want to create in the UK and beyond. And as part of that task, we hold as many kind of public events as we can. So this is the latest in that stream of public events. We're delighted to be welcoming Reverend Ryan Bennett in a minute to give a talk on the theme of living in an age of indifference, exploring the roots of spiritual protest in the works of William Temple and Dorothy Day. So I'm going to introduce Ryan in a minute. We're very honoured, Ryan, that I think this is the first public exegesis of your thesis that you submitted, I think, just a few days ago. So many congratulations on that. We're then equally delighted to have two very distinguished respondents to Ryan's lecture in the form of Sally Foster-Fulton and Will Storrar, and I'll introduce them at the time. And then that will probably, hopefully, leave us a good 20 to 25 minutes for questions from the floor. And again, a very warm welcome to all of you. Delighted you're with us. Final quick comment from me is that we will be recording this event, but only recording the speakers. So we will stop recording once we move into the public Q&A. Okay, so without any further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker for this evening. Ryan Bennett is a final year PhD candidate in divinity at the School of Divinity at the University of Edinburgh. He is a priest in the Scottish Episcopal Church. His PhD research concentrates on 20th century Christian socialism within the US and UK, focusing, as we already heard, on the work of William Temple and Dorothy Day. Ryan, it's a fantastic pleasure to have you with us, and over to you.
Chris, thank you very much for that introduction, and good evening to everyone. And I am immensely appreciative for your presence in this lecture and Q&A this evening. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank the William Temple Foundation and its leadership and staff, including Chris and Victoria and Katia, for enabling this lecture and Q&A to take place this evening. And in addition, I would also like to thank Professor Will Storrar and the Very Revd Sally Foster-Fulton for their willingness and enthusiasm to be responders to this presentation and lecture. I am immensely grateful to each one of you. The title of this evening's lecture, as Chris highlighted for us, is Living in an Age of Indifference, Exploring the Roots of Spiritual Protest in the Works of William Temple and Dorothy Day. I would like to acknowledge the contribution of both Chris and Katia in the formulation of this particular wording. This question took shape over the course of numerous Zoom conversations throughout the second half of last year, as we collectively discussed the acute relevance of both William Temple and Dorothy Day's social theologies in direct relation to growing levels of indifference across the world in this present moment. And in doing this, I would also like to acknowledge the presence of Dorothy's granddaughter, Kate Hennessy, and her husband, Gary, who in fact are sitting on the other side of this wall in my lounge room, who have been my house guests at present. So it's humbling to have Kate's presence tonight as well. Kate has written extensively and has spoken extensively on the life of her grandmother. I'd like to begin this lecture by not referring to either William Temple or Dorothy Day, but rather by drawing our collective attention to Article 1 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights. The UN Declaration was proclaimed by the United Nations General Assembly meeting in Paris on December the 10th, 1948. And I read, "All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood." End of quote. An important observation to note from the outset is that two notable women delegates, Hansa Mehta of India and Eleanor Roosevelt of the United States, played a significant role in the particular wording of the Declaration Charter as being, and I quote, "both widely credited with changing the phrase 'all men are born free and equal' to 'all human beings are born free and equal' in Article 1 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights." Article 1 clearly specifies the equality of all human life, and that in making this statement to be the underlining premise of the declaration across the world, takes us to look at the specific social theologies of both William Temple and Dorothy Day in specific relation to this question. As a way of introducing both William Temple and Dorothy Day into this discussion this evening, we also will look at a quick side view into doing a very quick AI search under the question, present examples of indifference across the world, and what's of indifference. And what is very interesting about this is what the response generates. And I quote them for you now. Number 1, humanitarian crises. Number 2, climate change inaction. Number 3, poverty inequality. Number 4, the normalization of suffering. Number 5, political apathy. We may resonate with one, several, or all of these AI-generated examples of indifference. In addition, we may think of several other relevant examples. I believe what becomes clear in determining varied, particular examples of indifference existing today is that there is a widening disconnect between the values promulgated by the Declaration of Human Rights and the experience of daily life by a growing number of persons across the world. In recognizing this important observation, the question arises, what sources of guidance and challenge do the social theologies of William Temple and Dorothy Day offer us as we face growing levels of global indifference? In posing this question, it is helpful to offer a brief biography of each figure, as the social and political landscape of their own respective eras contain both striking and sobering instances of indifference across the transatlantic region. Within the UK, American social theologian Dorothy Day, 1897 to 1980, may be less known than William Temple. Hence, we will address Day first. Day was born in New York City. Her father was a sports journalist, and his career took the Day family across the United States. Their time in San Francisco, California, played a definitive role in the development of Day's social conscience. The devastating San Francisco earthquake of 1906 left a huge trail of disaster and desolation for the city's urban population. Day notes that her mother's care for the earthquake victims instilled in a young Day an awareness for the needs of others. And I quote Dorothy, "Mother and all our neighbours were busy from morning to night, cooking hot meals. It was as though they were united in Christian solidarity. It makes one think of how people could, if they would, care for each other in times of stress, unjudgingly, with pity and with love." End quote. Day's family were nominal Christians who permitted Dorothy, along with her two older brothers, to join their local Chicago-based Episcopal Church. As an early teenager, Day develops a love of scripture and Anglican liturgy, including the Canticles and sung psalms as outlined in the Book of Common Prayer. She is subsequently prepared for baptism and confirmation, spending a year or so immersing herself in Chicago Anglican life. A bright student, she perceives that the Episcopal Church is a denomination within a mainline Protestant-dominated America. As a church which predominantly represents white-collar professional workers. And in her own words, I quote, "I left the Episcopal Church at this time quite definitely," end quote. In its place, she develops a teenage interest in the works of American social activist Jack London and Upton Sinclair. Whilst immersing herself in London and Sinclair, she doesn't give up on belief in God, whilst continuing to read religious texts such as the New Testament and John Wesley's sermons. Day, the young adult, drops out of university and pursues her lifelong interest in journalism, becoming a journalist for both socialist and communist newspapers in New York City. She embraces the life of a Greenwich Village bohemian, frequenting village mobster-owned bars and enjoying the company of fellow artists and writers. Her awareness of the marginalised status of working people remains consistent throughout, with a renewed interest in institutional religion finding its expression within the practice of the Roman Catholic Church. Following marriage, divorce, and the experience of an abortion, Day becomes a Catholic in the process of seeking baptism for her newborn child and mother of Kate, Tamar. The sociological association which this decision to become a Roman Catholic captures in Day's own reflection on this period, and I quote Day, "It was the Irish of New England, the Italians, the Hungarians, the Lithuanians, the Poles. It was the great mass of the poor, the workers, who were the Catholics in this country. and this fact in itself drew me to the church." End quote. Day's empathy with America's marginalized migrant Catholic workers ultimately led Day to establish the Catholic worker movement as a means of supporting and educating impoverished workers amidst the social and financial carnage generated by the Great Depression in 1933. William Temple, 1881 to 1944, his biography stands in contrast to that of Day on several levels. Temple is born into an upper-class clerical family, being the younger son of the Bishop of Exeter, Frederick Temple. Temple's early life is shaped by growing up within the confines of the ecclesiastical hierarchy of the established Church of England. His public school education places Temple in good stead to become an undergraduate at Balliol College, Oxford. This is a definitive period in the shaping of Temple's social conscience, as he comes to understand the influence of the Scottish philosopher and master of Balliol, Edward Caird. Temple's immersion in the school of British idealist philosophy and its subsequent influence on his thinking is best summarised by Peter Geyer and Rolf Peter Horstmann's definition of Caird's predecessor at Balliol and fellow idealist T.H. Green, and I quote, "He, Green, argues that knowledge never consists in the mere apprehension of discrete items, but in the recognition of order or relation, and that such order or relation is not given but is constituted by and in consciousness." Geyer and Horstmann observe in Green's notion of idealism its underlining value for an evolving, logical, and relational ordering of the world-creating process. Nothing, in their view, is left to chance, and importantly, this process can be both conceived and understood by an evolving human consciousness. Temple develops his own particular understanding of the central importance of knowledge as the basis of developing the human consciousness, and I quote Temple in his rather verbose use of language. This discovery by the mind of its own principles in the world, of its own environment, and that too in the strange portions of that world, at once invests knowledge with a value of its own. It is no longer good only because it enables us to act wisely. It is good in itself. End quote. Temple's conception of knowledge as containing value, I'd like to argue, assists us in understanding how a right exercise of knowledge is the catalyst, using Temple's words, to act wisely. In establishing Temple's own value for knowledge as an idea and how this idea shapes consciousness, provides the foundation for developing a social consciousness, both individual and collective. Temple scholar and successor as Archbishop of Canterbury, Michael Ramsey, offers an insightful observation on the association between Temple's philosophical and theological thinking. And I quote, "He, Temple, argues from the significance of mind to the supremacy of value, and from the emerging series of matter, life, mind, spirit to the incarnation as the great reality in which humanity is fulfilled. Ramsay observes that Temple sees no contradiction between his idealist philosophy and his Christian convictions. In fact, he agrees that Temple affirmed the belief in the incarnation was a natural progression in the development of human consciousness. For Temple, the incarnation of God into the world in the person of Jesus Christ is the moment of complete revelation. Temple understands that in the incarnation, God reveals God's self as desiring to embody all human life. Temple frames this notion in the following terms. Our argument has led to a conception which suggests, as the essential principle of revelation, the appreciation by divinely enlightened minds of divinely directed occurrences, and further requires for fullness of revelation the occurrence should take the form of a personal life of such sort as to be intelligible to and elicit sympathy from those persons to whom the revelation is given. It must be no mere theophany, but an incarnation. End of quote. In these words, Temple unfolds his idealistic conception of the evolutionary process of creation to include a Christian notion of revelation. He understands that God seeks to reveal God's self within the unfolding process of the creation. Hence, it's entirely natural to conceive that God would consciously choose to embody human life in the person of Jesus Christ. By embodying human life, God reveals the essence of God's own nature as being entirely engaged with all human activity, including the evolving development of a social human consciousness that takes place within real time. Temple's ecclesiastical career was marked by both his intellectual capacity as well as his natural pastoral instinct. He was an astute leader who displayed a natural capacity to translate his personal Christian beliefs into his genuine interest to be engaged in issues of social importance. The period in which he held the office of Archbishop of York and leading to his translation to be Archbishop of Canterbury in 1942 saw an unprecedented period of social upheaval. Throughout the entirety of his ordained life, his extensive body of publications, coupled together with his rigorous schedule of public speaking, provided the basis for Temple to develop his distinct social theology. This theology took as its basis a fundamental need to maintain consistent engagement between the church and society in tackling the significant social dislocation resulting from the Great Depression. Like Temple, Day believed that the doctrine of the incarnation offered the theological framework to justify the establishment of the Catholic worker movement in New York City in 1933. In direct contrast to Temple's eminent ecclesial career, Day established the Worker as a single mother, with no official status within the Roman Catholic Church. Amidst the social upheaval generated by the Great Depression, she understood that the same dislocation was predominantly experienced by a significant, marginalised working class population. Hence, Day taught the need to offer service with no partiality. And I quote, "We felt respect for the poor and destitute as those nearest to God, as those chosen by Christ for his compassion. Christ lived among men, the great mystery of the Incarnation, which meant that God became man, that man might become God, was a joy that made us want to kiss the earth in worship, because his feet once trod that same earth. It was a mystery that we as Catholics accepted, but there were also the facts of Christ's life, that he was born in a stable, that he did not come to be a temporal king, that he worked with his hands, spent his first years of his life in exile, and the rest of his early manhood in a crude carpenter's shop in Nazareth." End quote. Day identified with the person of Jesus Christ as the marginalised working man, a man who experienced refugee and asylum status. He consciously chose to model servant leadership, which did not correspond with the established models of kingly rule. And this was evident of the divine power's will not to be manipulated by human conceptions of power. The rise of authoritarian regimes across Europe provided Day with sure evidence of this fact, given the culture of such regimes was to encourage indifference in order to extend a political will. Underneath Day's somewhat pietistic use of language is a clear attraction to Christ's direct engagement with working, marginalised persons. In exploring present-day examples of indifference, with specific relation to both Day and Temple's distinctive understandings of indifference, requires a coupling of their respective denunciation of various forms of indifference. And in order to achieve this, this study needs to pay attention to a particular period within the 20th century in which Day and Temple shared in common. Worldwide, the 1930s and its progression into the devastation of the Second World War was a tumultuous period across the world. It was a period in which the catastrophic scale of financial and social collapse resulting from the Wall Street financial crash of 1929 submerged much of the world into the Great Depression. The transatlantic region, including the United States, the United Kingdom, and much of Europe and beyond, experienced unparalleled levels of financial and industrial collapse, high unemployment, and adverse poverty. Day writes candidly about her personal experience of witnessing a well-organised, communist-led workers' demonstration in Washington, D.C. in 1932, and I quote, "I watched that ragged horde and thought to myself, these are Christ's poor. He was one of them. He was a man like other men. And he chose his friends amongst the ordinary workers. These men feel they have been betrayed by Christianity. Men are not Christian today. If they were, this sight would not be possible. Far dearer in the sight of God, perhaps, are these hungry, ragged ones. Then all those smug, well-fed Christians who sit in the homes, cowering in fear of the communist menace. End quote. Regardless of what we think of Day's synopsis of these communist workers' lack of Christian faith, her recognition of Christ as the incarnate one who chooses to live his life among the impoverished workers as a working person is undeniable. If this message was not direct enough, Day makes a strong indictment against Christians whom she perceives as indifferent to the needs of these poverty-stricken workers. Further still, Day believes that the indifference she encounters is politically motivated, speaking to the deep fear within American society of communist infiltration. For Day, such fear creates an apathy which manifests itself in a disconnection from the experience of others' suffering for self-motivated preservation. In saying this, it can be tempting to forget that such motivations can be stimulated by a set of complex and at times contradictory set of factors. This said, Day makes a definitive stand for where she believes Christ stands in situations such as these. Antonis Klapsis outlines the precise dangers caused by such instability across Europe throughout this period, along with the consequences of such instability on the political arena. And I quote, "The Great Depression of the 1930s greatly affected political developments in Europe. Economic stagnation proved beneficial for far-right parties, which generally saw their influence increasing. Authoritarian regimes became established in most European countries at this time, the most important being the Nazi regime in Germany." End of quote. As the horrors of the Holocaust were starting to emerge in 1942 and 1943, David S. Wyman observes the responses of both Day and Temple. In each instance, Wyman highlights their personal distress at the situation, and I quote, "By May 1943, for instance, extensive news had appeared regarding the destruction of European Jewry. Yet Dorothy Day, the leader of the Catholic worker movement, recalled speaking at a meeting that month at which a member of the audience arose to protest defense of the Jews and to state emphatically that she did not believe the stories of the atrocities. She was applauded by the several hundred present." Against such astounding unbelief, Day reflected, "The mind is stunned." End quote. In referencing Day's shock at the response of several hundred people at this American event, Wyman draws attention to Temple's response to the same perplexing and deeply troubling situation at a large-scale public event which he hosted at the Albert Hall in October 1942. And I quote, "In England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Temple, unconvinced by the forced labour explanation for the mass deportations from France, was quoted in the press as being almost certain that planned annihilation was underway. Speaking in late October to a London mass meeting to protest Nazi persecution of the Jews, William Temple declared that it is hard to resist the conclusion that there is a settled purpose to exterminate the Jewish people if it can be done. End quote. In exploring both Temple and Day's response to significant questions of indifference within the 1930s and throughout the Second World War, such instances highlight that each figure held an expansive understanding of humanity, arguing that all humanity should be afforded the same rights and freedoms with no exceptions. It is well documented and recorded in a previous Temple tract by Rob Thompson in 2017 that Temple played a crucial role in advocating for the British government to make a public statement concerning the atrocities taking place against Europe's Jews. This historic event took place in the House of Commons on December the 17th, 1942. I draw these important historical instances to your attention in order to make the point that both Day and Temple's conception of the doctrine of the Incarnation embraced a worldview which upheld the theological position that God's incarnation into the world in the person of Jesus Christ embodied all human life. As such, Temple and Day both believed that their strong public advocacy for these critical issues of humanitarian concern were firmly established on Christian principles. Day confronted issues of anti-Semitism, racism, bigotry, workers' exploitation, civil rights, nuclear disarmament, and many others from the perspective that the Catholic worker movement denounced any movement, action, regime, or policy which they believed compromised the humanity of all persons. She developed a social theology which was worked out in practice by acts of service to impoverished, marginalised persons over the course of her 50 years of social activism. Reflecting on the first publications of the Catholic Worker newspaper in 1933, Day marks the importance of directly tackling issues of indifference as being a prime justification of the Catholic workers' existence. I quote, "In the first issue of the paper, we dealt with Negro labour on the levees of the South, exploited as cheap labour by the War Department. We wrote of women and children in industry and the spread of unemployment. The second issue carried a story of a farmers' strike in the Midwest and the condition of restaurant workers in cities. In the third issue, there were stories of textile strikes and child labour in that industry. The next month, coal and milk strikes. In the sixth issue of the paper, we were already combating anti-Semitism." End quote. Temple understood the importance of civil responsibility and that the established Church of England had a moral obligation to be a public voice of advocacy for issues of injustice as of paramount importance. Such actions were motivated by a strong theological conviction to develop an incarnational shaped social theology. Temple conceives that this particular kind of social theology is worked out in community, understanding that communitarian expressions of life provide the ethical basis to embrace personal freedom. He sets out in his seminal text, which Chris has made reference to, Christianity and the Social Order in 1942, a practical roadmap for developing a secure and sustainable post-World War II Britain. Education, welfare, and employment were pivotal cornerstones of Temple's vision for a post-war Britain. The success of achieving such high aspirations in Temple's view is through the exercise of personal freedom. And I quote Temple, "Actual freedom is realized in fellowships of such a kind and size that the individual can take a living share in their activities. Personality is made real in and through social fellowships, and we need what Maritain has called a democracy of the person, and not only the democracy of the individual." End quote. Temple's differentiation between the person and the individual speaks to his conviction that the person is formed within community, and that it's within community that individuals become persons. He acknowledges that the source for his thinking on these important questions was influenced by the 20th century French Catholic philosopher Jacques Maritain. Maritain's personalist philosophy emphasized the critical importance of the development of persons within community, and that such development enabled the establishment of moral standards and ethical parameters for the development of the human of the human person. Both Temple and Day were drawn to Maritain's personalist philosophy, along with that of fellow personalist Emmanuel Mounier. And it's important to note that Day was a personal friend of Jacques Maritain and his wife Reza. It's also important to acknowledge the influence of personalism on Temple and Day, because it plays a significant role on their thinking concerning the question of indifference. Both figures, in my opinion, represent two 20th century social theologians who purposely sought to identify specific instances of indifference, and in identifying them, publicly denounce them. Given there isn't any evidence that neither Temple or Day corresponded with each other, the alignment of their mutual denunciation of the examples of indifference raised in this paper is significant for several reasons. Primarily, it's significant to note for our purposes that their mutual belief in the doctrine of the incarnation as the fundamental theological basis of their public justification to denounce indifference and its compromising consequences of prohibiting the rights and freedoms of the human person. The doctrine of the incarnation stands outside this perimeter and denounces any prohibition of rights or freedoms for any person in any time. We live in an age where there are multiple instances of indifference which bear a striking similarity to the instances which both Temple and Day addressed. Soberly, some of the particular instances of indifference facing the world today are the same. Coupled with this disturbing realism, new instances of indifference have emerged and continue to emerge at a rapid rate. Temple and Day's legacy reveal to us that Christian teaching and tradition have a great deal to say, in particular, encouraging social teachings and forms of activism which philosophies such as personalism promoted then and still promote now. This moment in history seeks a response, not a reaction. Do we envisage our own personhood shaped by community has a response to make? That's the question. Amen.
Thank you, Ryan, very much for laying out so clearly and in such a detailed way the foundations for an approach to indifference for our current age, which you begin to outline towards the end of your lecture. So thank you very much for that very informative and detailed account of both Temple and Day's thinking and the origins and the context out of which their thinking emerged. It's now my great pleasure to introduce two respondents who are going to talk for about 10 minutes in terms of their responses to what Ryan has said, as a way in, I think, of hopefully leading us into a fruitful dialogue and conversation at the end. And I'm going to ask Sally if she'd like to go first. The Very Revd Sally Foster-Fulton is currently Christian Aid's UK and Global Churches Ambassador, having held several roles, including Head of Christian Aid Scotland and Head of Nations and Church Relations. Sally now focuses on developing and nurturing strong relationships between UK actors and global faith partnerships, developing creative writing networks for worship resources, and campaigning and working with the transition team at Christian Aid as they move to a new multi-country cluster model. Sally is an ordained Church of Scotland minister, former convener of the Church and Society Council, and served as the Kirk's moderator from 2023 to 24. Sally, it's a great pleasure to have you with us, and over to you.
Oh, thank you so much. And it was an absolute joy to be here. Thanks to Ryan for inviting me not only to respond, but to listen and to learn. I will keep my responses concise because I'm really greedy when it comes to hearing and learning from others. So I want to make sure that there's plenty of time to listen. Christian Aid bases its cross-cutting work on a human rights-based approach. So Article 1 resonates with my considerations. Yet I have to admit being conflicted about the reference to Hansa Mehta and Eleanor Roosevelt's intervention regarding the wording. Because granted, from all men are born free and equal to all human beings is a step forward. But we just couldn't seem to get it over the line. Listen again. All human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. They are endowed with reason and conscience and should act towards one another in a spirit of brotherhood. One step at a time. It does point to an opportunity we have to use examples like Ryan used and like Article 1 to highlight our ongoing challenge to move further, to be brave and bold enough to say, yes, that is good, but look, we need to move even further towards justice and equity. How might we express inclusivity and inclusively what we mean or we think we mean by brotherhood? I make that comment only partially tongue-in-cheek, because if the model we aspire to is brotherhood, what indeed are we missing out on? How are we limiting ourselves as a human family? Across the world, gender inequality continues to be widespread and deep-rooted. And of course, there has been great progress, but current statistics still demonstrate stark inequalities. Globally, women and girls live in extreme poverty more than men and boys. In 2023, an estimated 309.6 million females live below the poverty line, compared to 290 million males. At work, women continue to be underrepresented in professional leadership roles. At the current rate of progress, it's going to take over 200 years to close the gender gap in economic opportunity. Across the world, 16.4 billion hours a day are spent by women in unpaid care work, according to the International Labor Organization. The distribution of domestic duties continues to heavily weight towards women and girls, causing them to miss out on opportunities for education, employment, leadership roles. If a monetary value was applied to all the unpaid care work done by women aged 15 and over around the world, it would amount to more than 10.8 trillion a year. 1 in 3 women are subjected to physical, sexual, or domestic violence. Less than 20% of the world's landowners are women. Closer to home, medical equipment and devices are designed primarily using the male form, and that poses significant risks to misdiagnosis, increased complications, and injury. A few examples are personal protective equipment, respirators, goggles, gloves, gowns. They're designed for the average male body. Orthopedic implants, devices like knees and hips, again, designed for the male body, leading to higher failure rates, pain, and a need for revision surgery for women. Cardiovascular devices, surgical tools and instruments, medications and doses, diagnostic tools. If the model we aspire to is brotherhood, what indeed are we missing out on? How are we limiting ourselves as a human family? I make that point to refer back to Ryan's really important point about indifference. When our model is indifference or thoughtlessness, it can have impacts that we do not even understand. My second point is indifference the driving force, or is there something deeper that we need to unpack? And it's a genuine question that I'm looking forward to hearing. Ryan talked a lot about the complicating factors. So is indifference the word? As Dorothy Day said of the Christians not responding to the poverty of others in that Washington protest, and it was intentional. It was based on fear. It was based on fear of communist infiltration. What else might it have been based on? Fear of losing our place now that we've arrived. My first point regarding gender manifests itself, of course, other injustices and inequities, immigration, climate change, racism, structured poverty. Reflecting on the first publications of the Catholic Worker newspaper in 1933, Day remarked about the importance of directly tackling issues of indifference as being a prime justification of the Catholic Workers' existence. Again, as Ryan said, Negro labor on the levees of the South, exploited cheap labor by the War Department, women and children in industry and the spread of unemployment, the farmers' strike in the Midwest, and the condition of restaurant workers in cities, stories of textile strikes and labor strikes and child labor in the industry, and then combating anti-Semitism. Indifference? Or is there something deeper that we need to unearth? My question regarding the premise is whether indifference is the core, or we need to dig deeper and find what's underneath. Third point that I really enjoyed thinking about, the incarnation as the antithesis of indifference. As Ryan said, Temple understands that God seeks to reveal God's self within the unfolding process of creation. Hence, it's entirely natural to conceive that God would consciously choose to embody human life in the body and the person of Jesus Christ. God reveals the essence of God's own nature as being entirely engaged with human life. And then Day follows that thought when she said she felt respect for the poor and destitute as those nearest to God, as those chosen by Christ for his compassion. What I really loved was when she said this: the great mystery of the incarnation, which meant that God became man, I'm going to say human, and so that human could become God, was a joy that made us want to kiss the earth in worship. In Christian Aid, I learned a term or a word in Zulu that I used as my year-long theme for my year as moderator, and it's a Zulu word, Ubuntu. And it means I am because you are. And it unpacks that innate worth of every single human being. And it goes further than that. It is a theology that says when you look into the eyes of another human being, you are looking into the face of God. And the way you treat that other human being is the way that you treat God. Such an antithesis to indifference, and something that we can hold on to and highlight and push for. And my final point, from individual to person, I loved that thought and that understanding and that push. The success of achieving such high aspirations in Temple's view through the exercise of personal freedom can only be lived out in community. Temple's differentiation between the person and the individual speaks to his conviction that the person can only be formed within community, and that it's within community that individuals become fully human. Fully human. Only in community. Only when we realize that there is no them and us, there's only us. I'll close my thoughts by reminding us of a really important pivotal case in Scottish law, Donahue versus Stevenson. It was a landmark ruling. And I'll tell you the story. It was May Donahue, who had been taken out by a friend, and she got a ginger beer float. And when she poured the ginger beer, it had an opaque bottle. And when she poured the ginger beer over her ginger beer float, a decomposed snail came out of the jar, and it caused her great distress. And she sued the corporation. She sued the manufacturer, and she won. And the details of the case were based on this Good Samaritan. The legal argument ruled that duty of care, that you had to pay attention to your actions and your inactions. And if your actions or your inactions could possibly, in your imagination as you look at community, could possibly harm someone else, then you were responsible. It goes back into that final thought about individual versus person, individual versus community, and how we begin to wrap ourselves around that personhood of community. So thank you so much, Ryan, for all that you've shared with us tonight. And I look forward to the conversation.
Thank you, Sally, very much for providing those three very stimulating thoughts and questions that emerged for you out of Ryan's lecture. It's now my great pleasure to invite Professor Will Storrar to do the same. William Storrar is an ordained minister of the Church of Scotland. After parish ministry, he taught practical theology in Aberdeen, Glasgow, and latterly Edinburgh, where he directed the Center for Theology and Public Issues. From 2005 to 2025, he was the director of the Center for Theological Inquiry at Princeton. New Jersey, an independent institute for interdisciplinary research into global concerns. Whilst at the Center for Theological Inquiry, he initiated the Global Network for Public Theology. He has served as a visiting professor at Stellenbosch University, South Africa, and Glasgow Caledonian University. He is currently an honorary professor at New College, Edinburgh University. Will, it's great to have you with us. Over to you.
Thanks very much, Chris. It's great to be back with the William Temple Foundation, to whom I owe so much in that history of my own biography at Edinburgh and at CTI in Princeton, not least having the privilege of welcoming John Atherton as our visiting fellow in theology and economics in Princeton. Chris, thank you. Ryan, I want to echo everything that Sally had just said and express my appreciation for this rich paper and for the great service you've done to us all in the field of public theology by bringing these two remarkable figures, Temple and Day, together to challenge our own thinking. I want to focus briefly on two key concepts in your presentation. One, Sally has already explored so fruitfully with you, the notion of an age of indifference, and then come back to the notion of personalism. First of all, I'm intrigued by why you focused on an age of indifference rather than an age of injustice or an age of inequality, both of which might well have applied to Day and Temple in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, as well as to the current day. But I think you've chosen a concept that is so fruitful and offers us a fresh way of thinking about public issues and public concerns from a Christian theological perspective. Thank you for exploring the way, and particularly in which the way Dorothy Day understood indifference. This move from being intimidated by a culture of fear into a state of apathy, which leads to indifference to the suffering of others and a primal concern for self-preservation. Your comment in your presentation that the authoritarian regimes in Europe in the 30s for Day were creating indifference as an act of political will. And that really resonates with the present day and both sides of the Atlantic. I think Sally's already referred to this case study you did of the ways in which both Day was shocked and Temple responded to the indifference of America and Britain to the suffering of the Jews and the growing proven reports of persecution and worse under the Nazi regime in continental Europe. As I read them in your paper, heard them again just now, I was reminded of the analysis of a German sociologist, more recently, Wolf Leppenez, to why the Nazis were able to carry out this appalling program of genocide in the midst of a cultured and civilized and highly educated German population. Why were they indifferent? And Leppenez has a powerful observation that I think resonates with the insights of Dorothy Day, that it was the lack of moral concern in everyday life that led ultimately to the Holocaust. Leppenez says, it's when your neighbor was taken away and you said nothing. It's when the local synagogue was burnt down and you did nothing. It's when your relative was forced to divorce their Jewish relative that you did not protest. It's in the indifference of everyday life, what he calls the subtle silence we have in the face of such action, that evil on this scale can take hold. And as Dorothy Day said, indifference cultivated deliberately as an act of political will by such authoritarian regimes. And Leppenez, in commenting on this in one of his books, he says, the accelerating disappearance of decency in everyday life is the problem Germans must be concerned about above all in that period. the accelerating collapse of decency in everyday life. Now, that is alarming when we come to think about the accelerating collapse of decency in social media and in public political discourse on both sides of the Atlantic. So I think you have found a term that really resonates with the crisis of democracy on both sides of the Atlantic, and it is that accelerating collapse of decency as a fundamental human practice, first in everyday life, and then in our political and public life. So thank you for that insight. I think we should explore that and consider its ramifications from Dorothy Day to the present. And then secondly, you talk about the Christian personalism of both Day and Temple, influenced by Jacques Maritain. But I want to raise a problem of drawing on that kind of Christian personalism for today. As Sally pointed out, it's rooted for them both in the incarnation. Although you brought out in your paper, I thought brilliantly, the way in which Temple arrives at the incarnation through a philosophical discourse and evolution, whereas Day comes at it from the working hands of Jesus in the crude carpenter's shop, two very different routes. But the incarnation is obviously central. But my question is, what is the economic and material dimension of a Christian personalism? In other words, particularly in Christianity and the social order, Temple sets out at length Christian attitudes towards the economy and property and economic questions, and says that property is not an absolute right, it's not an exclusive right, but it is, in the world we live in, it's important for human freedom and well-being to be able to have some personal property and to own it in security. I'm not sure how Day would come at it with a more communitarian approach, with the Catholic worker movement's approach to economic life and social life. But Temple, writing in the 40s, is clear that property is important for human well-being and freedom and flourishing. Now, how can Christian personalism then today respond to the current economic crisis on both sides of the Atlantic, when the young don't have secure employment but live in precarious employment, short-term contracts, and have no hope of getting on the housing ladder, the home ownership ladder? And then, above all, the tsunami that's already upon us, the impact of AI on employment, not only for poor workers, although it should be pointed out that one study showed the first impact of AI was on women at checkouts who had lost their jobs, echoing what Sally said about the gender inequalities. And that is true of AI as well as the history of the global capitalist economy. So how can Christian personalism respond to the economic and material dimension of human flourishing, freedom, and well-being in our present age? Thank you for raising these rich questions about decency in an age of indifference and about work for those who care about the person in community.